Folks, I think we'll make a start. So welcome to the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. This is a joint series of seminars that we are doing in partnership with the Dialogue Society. And we are pleased once again to have representatives of the Dialogue Society with us in the room and also with us remotely. This is a series of events that were first organised in conversation with myself and our associate director, Professor Paul Weller, to whom I will be handing over in a moment. These have come on the back of two book launches, a book launch of two books, should I say, that have both been authored by Paul Weller, and these are available at a distance, I believe. So if you're in the room, we've actually got flyers, and for those who are joining us remotely, I will have sent on the electronic links to those. That's is Jula Gillen's Teaching and Practice, and his Making Transitions, that are both excellent books by Paul Weller. He's much too modest to say this, but I would encourage you to buy them. They are very, very important and prophetic pieces of work that I'm sure people will be studying for many years to come. Anyway, with that brief advert out of the way, I now hand over to my colleague and associate, Professor Paul Weller.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony, and apologies to all, but especially to our speaker tonight, Jeremy Rodel, that I can't be present with you in person. Unfortunately, having escaped the dreaded COVID for a long time, despite being boosted and everything, I succumbed to it and only just tested negative, so I thought it probably not wise to risk at least those of you who are physically present. But that does mean, sadly, I'm not able to be with you in person, and in particular not to be able to meet and greet Jeremy, our speaker this evening. But we were very keen in planning this series, which is, we didn't frame it as interfaith or interreligious dialogue, but as interreligious and interconvictional dialogue, quite deliberately, because we wanted to take into account the perspectives that were not defined in terms of religion, religiosity, self-definitions of religion. And therefore, in planning the series, we thought it good to see if we could approach Humanists UK, and Humanists UK have, ideally, an officer responsible precisely for dialogue, and that person is our guest speaker this evening. So we welcome him very much. We look forward to the contribution you have to make in terms of input, and then in questions and discussion that will follow on from that. So I hand over now without more ado. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I'm not quite sure where to face, because if I look here, I see the room, and if I look there, I see the people. I see Paul and the people online. So I'll look vaguely in the direction of the room. And I'm sorry not to meet you, Paul, and thanks for your welcome. I think perhaps I watched last week's seminar on Muslims and dialogue, and Soraya prefaced her remarks by an apology. She said, well, I'm sorry, I'm not the right sort of academic. And well, I have to preface my remarks by an apology that I'm not an academic at all. So you have to make of that what you will. So let me, of course, there are slides, so let me go and try and find those. Right, so what I'm going to try and do is three things. The first thing to talk about a bit about humanism and dialogue, it's really what it says on the tin. I thought then it would be worth looking at the religion and belief landscape in the country, and from that looking at why it's important from my perspective, and hopefully from yours at the end of this, to include the non-religious in dialogue. And obviously from what Paul has said, we're pushing at a bit of an open door on this one. And finally, to look at some objections to dialogue, some of the challenges to dialogue. One or two of them are rather specific to humanists, but some of them are not. And there are a whole lot of these, and I've just picked out 4 that I thought might be interesting to talk about. So now, obviously, I should also say humanists are free thinkers. So, I'm telling you what I think. It's my interpretation. It's 90%, I think, what most humanists would think, but you can probably find a humanist in the street who would disagree with most things. We're a sort of rebellious bunch. Anyway, so humanism and dialogue. So firstly, what humanism is. Well, the first thing is that humanism is basically a naturalistic worldview. So it's, most humanists would say that you should trust to reason and the scientific method to find out facts about the world. Okay, so that means looking at evidence, being willing to change your mind if the new evidence comes along, all of that. It isn't scientism in the sense that, of course, there are plenty of questions to which science doesn't have the answer. Is the music of Beethoven or Miley Cyrus superior? Science won't give you the answer to that. So humanism isn't a religion because it doesn't have any of the characteristics of a religion. I think William James said one of the characteristics of religion was that belief in an underpinning belief in an unseen order and adjusting your life in accordance with that. Obviously, humanism doesn't believe in an unseen order in that supernatural sense, and it doesn't have any practices that goes with it. So most humanists, as a result of that, are atheists. I'm an atheist, but I don't define myself as an atheist because that's just a negative. You can be an atheist and you could be the most wonderful human being that's ever lived, or you could be an atheist and be an axe murderer. It tells you one thing, that you don't believe what the other guy thinks about God. That's all. So I call myself a humanist. Some humanists are agnostics. The second thing is then that raises the question about morality. Obviously, as a humanist, I think, well, morality, these are human things. This is a feature of our humanity, and moral guidance and thinking arises from the fact that we've evolved as social animals. We've learned to cooperate with each other to get things done, but we're particularly good at having the ability to reason, so we can think stuff through. Now, of course, what that means is that we have concerns for other humans and indeed for other animals. And there's a huge area, of course, of common ground between here and virtually all the world religions. And the obvious example of that is the Golden Rule. Confucius came up with the idea, 5,000 BC, 500 BC, many others, all completely unconnected. You come up with the idea that treating other people the way you want to be treated if you were them is a good thing to do in a cooperative society. And this is just, an example of where I would say is it arises from our common humanity. Now, another thing is that obviously I don't believe in any sort of afterlife because I don't see any evidence for that. And so for humanists generally, this is our one life, so the key thing is make the most of it. And I don't also see any discernible purpose in the universe. It's just there, doesn't itself have any meaning or anything. But obviously life has meaning, and as a humanist, I give meaning and purpose to my life through the relationships I have, the things I do, and helping other people to do the same, to make the most of it. And finally, sort of feeding from that, of course, is try and make a positive contribution to make society better. We ask people.
Please unmute yourself. Please mute yourself.
In the world. Splash.
Can you hear me now, Paul?
Yes, yes.
Where did you lose it?
Soon after the children in the background. So I think we missed 2 or 3 minutes, I'm afraid. Yeah.
All right. So I think you can read what's on the slide. I think the last bit I was just explaining was about secularism and what I would mean by secularism, which is not being non-religious, and it isn't just separation of church and state. It's that the state should indeed be neutral in matters of religion and belief, but also that there's freedom of religion and belief is guaranteed, providing it doesn't erode the rights and freedoms of others, and that the state doesn't discriminate against everybody on the basis of their religion and belief.
Thank you.
So, and then we've got the slogan, think for yourself, act for everyone. Now, when it comes to dialogue, so if you look on the Humanist UK website, this is what you see as the definition of dialogue, an engagement between people with different approaches to life to build mutual understanding, identify common ground, and where it makes sense, engage in shared action. So there's a history within humanism of this push for an open society, and I won't go through the history of humanism, but an example of that was there was a gentleman called Harold Blackham, who was the president of what was then called British Humanist Association in the 1960s, and he was one of the co-founders of an organization called the Social Morality Council, which wasn't like the Taliban virtue and organization. It was an organization of Christians, Jews and humanists who got together to talk about issues of moral and ethical issues. So this is, example of dialogue. What we've done in recent years is we've decided that we should, to try and encourage people to do this, we've run as a one-day training seminar for people interested in dialogue. Everybody goes on to that, signs up to a code of conduct for dialogue, which is based on the Interfaith Network for the UK's code of conduct, but tweaked so that it's inclusive and non-religious, because it's not perfectly done. But doing that made us think, why is it? What are we trying to do with dialogue? And we came up with 3 things, and I think those 3 things are probably common for most people, most groups engaged in dialogue. 3 main things. The first one, we want people to understand us. There's lots of misunderstandings about humanism. So, we want people to understand what humanism is. Just as we know that when we engage with religious people, they want us to understand their faith perspective, which is invariably slightly different to what you thought it was when you did that. So it's to ensure humanism is well understood. The second one is the one I've already alluded to. Humanists are believers in a peaceful, plural society. We want people to live cooperatively, and dialogue is a way of making a positive contribution to doing that. So it's a good thing to do from that point of view. And the final one, though, is one that we thought, okay, but there's something else here. And the other thing is, it's an enriching experience for us, for people, for everybody, for people that get engaged in dialogue. It's part of your own personal development, and you do it because you get something out of it. It's part of your personal journey. So those are the 3 reasons that we give and we talk about in our training. Now, obviously, the definition of dialogue is very broad that we've used, and there are lots of different types of dialogue. There's this organized interfaith dialogue, and as Paul rightly pointed out, interfaith is a word that we are rather uncomfortable with because it excludes us. We're not faith, so and now the issue is that that's the word that's used in this country for this activity to a very large extent. So what can you do? Do you say, well, okay, you're excluding me, we're not going to get involved? Well, that would be stupid, because do you try and say, well, we're only going to get involved, or provided you change the terminology? Well, that would be a bit presumptuous. So I think what people have done, there are some cases where, like in local interfaith forums, have changed their titles to the Religion and Belief Forum or something. For a lot of us, say, okay, it's not ideal, but doing the stuff is more important than arguing about the terminology. So take the opportunity to make the wording inclusive where you can, in terms of reference inclusive and things, but don't get too hung up on the language. Let's just get on with it. We've also done some, I won't go through all of these, but we've done public events. This was one a few years ago. We did jointly with a group called New Horizons in British Islam. This is at Conway Hall in London. And the person on the left-hand side there, I'm going to, is Dilwar Hussain, who founded the group. He's from Leicester. And the second from the left is Andrew Copson, who's the chief executive of Humanist UK. I'll go through a number of others. I won't go through all of them. But a couple just to mention. One is that a number of the people who've done this training, who are interested in thinking about dialogue, are people who aren't really going to get involved in formal dialogue at all. But they're people who do things like are involved in pastoral support, people working in hospitals and prisons. So we've got a lot of those people, most of them volunteers, some of them are in paid positions. I think there's a couple of cases where they're the head of the unit in the hospital. So their colleagues are by definition people from other religions or beliefs. So it's like the sort of chaplaincy group. So they encounter people every day. So this was important for them. And they said, we know this is the dialogue of being there, one of them said, which I thought was a rather nice phrase. So a lot of this is about personal conversation. And the final one thing I thought just worth touching on is this academic exploration. There's been, there was this book published called Religion and Atheism Beyond the Divide, published in 2017, co-edited by a Christian theologian, Anthony Carroll, who's currently at Muirfield in Midlands, and Richard Norman, who's the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at University of Kent and a very distinguished humanist. So this was a collection of essays, people written from all sorts of different perspectives. And the first prefacing all of these essays was a write-up of a dialogue between Rowan Williams, who I guess everybody here knows, and Professor Raymond Tallis, who's a humanist philosopher and neuroscientist. Very interesting worth reading. And that has spawned an ongoing series of small group dialogues, primarily among academics. A few others go along. And this is sort of exploration to say, okay, let's sort of park the fact that we don't agree about the existence of God. What else? Where's there common ground? Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? But looking at it from an academic point of view. So that's it's fairly obvious why humanists engaged in dialogue. Okay, so that's the first one of these three. So, humanism and dialogue. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the religion and belief landscape in the country. Because here we're going through a massive change, but because it's not an overnight change, people aren't really it doesn't feel like a change. So the country is going through a very big change in terms of the religion and belief landscape. Now, in terms of data on this, we've got two primary sources. There's been loads of surveys and things like this, but there are two sets of sources that people look at. The main one and the best one is the British Social Attitudes Survey. And this is a survey that's been done every year since 1983. So it gives you a fantastic run of data. And since 1998, every 10 years, they've done a deep dive on religion. So the last one was done using data from 2018, and it was published in 2019. And what it asks is, obviously, when you talk about religion, you immediately hit in the problem, what is religion? What do you mean? And obviously, you can talk about beliefs, or you can talk about practices, how many people go to church or mosque every week, and you can talk about belonging, identity, community. And what this focuses on is the last one, is about how you identify yourself. Okay. The census, for the past three censi, I suppose, has asked a question about religion. It's a terrible question. And they made a mistake at the beginning, and because they don't want to lose continuity of data, they can't change it. And the question they ask is, what is your religion? Now, of course, you ask somebody, what is your religion? A lot of people think, oh, I suppose I ought to have one. And so the result of this, compared to other sources of data, most other sources of data, it tends to overstate Christian, understate no religion. But the great strength of the consensus is, of course, it's not based on a sample, it's everybody. So you can drill right down into local areas, and that's its great strength. Anyway, so looking at the social attitude survey data, this is what you get. So I've just put this on a chart. And if you just look firstly, there's a broad picture. One line it hasn't got on here is the sum of all the Christian lines. And if you went to the left-hand side of the chart, 1983, about 2/3 of the people in the country would, if you ask them this question, do you regard yourself as belonging to any particular religion? And if they said yes, which one? 2/3 of the population would say, yes, I'm a Christian of some sort. Okay. And about 1/3 would have said, no, I don't have a religion. They was answered no to this question. Where we are now, about a 1/3 say Christian, some sort of Christian, in answer to this question, and about, well, over half now say no to that question. So this is a very big change in what is historically a very small period, and obviously it was starting before 1983. So you can see that the nuns, the no religion line, the red one, is the one going up at the top. We've got some other data. We've done some own polling through YouGov, and we reckon very roughly half of that, 50%, have a broadly humanist worldview. So they broadly have the view that I've shared with you. Not all non-religious people have a humanist worldview, but many do. And that's a lot of people. You know, that's bigger than any other single group. The thing about the other thing that's going on, of course, is that the non-Christian religions, right on the 1983, were really small. It was only about 3%, and now it's about 10%. So this is also a very big change. And of that 10%, half is people who identify as Muslims. Okay, so far and away bigger than anything else. Now, if you look at the high level on this, and as the British Social Attitude Survey, there was a write-up by two distinguished sociologists of religion, David Burse and Stephen Bruce, from their latest report. And what they say is, what about this is a loss of religion? What's going on? And the important point that they point out is it's not people losing their faith as adults. That's not what's going on. What's going on is it's intergenerational change. So it's a quote from them. They say, well, two non-religious parents successfully transmit their lack of religion. Two religious parents have a 50-50 chance of passing on the faith. One religious parent does only half as well as two. So that's what they say. Sounds, very convincing. They talk about a half-life of religion in the country and so on. The problem is that's a generalization. It masks a lot of complexity about what's going on underneath. Because the reality, as you can see from this chart, is that there really is only one line that's really, really going down a lot. And that's the sort of brown line. And that's the Church of England. It's going down really quickly. On the left-hand side, so it's gone from about 40%. These are this is a 3-year rolling average. So at the beginning it was 40%, and it's now about 12, 13%. That's a huge, huge change. But if you take that away, the other religious lines don't give that story at all. So the Catholic line, the green one, is going down, but it's declining much more slowly. And one of the reasons it's declining more slowly is because there was a big injection of new, relatively young Catholics into the countries in the 90s, because there's a lot of immigration from Catholic countries, particularly Poland. It's declined, but not so much. But you can see also among the Christian groups, there's this blue line that's actually going up. And that's all the other sorts of Christians. And in that line, okay, it's got Methodists and Baptists. I'm aware this is a college with the Baptist Foundation. they're relatively small in the total scheme of things. The big driver of the increase has been independent evangelical churches, African churches, some Orthodox churches, of course, a lot of people now, a lot of Ukrainians coming to this country at the moment, Pentecostal churches, the churches that have taken over the old cinema. And that line, as you can see, about 3 years ago, it crossed the Church of England line. So there are more of those people than there are Anglicans. So this is a big, big change. At the bottom are the non-religious, non-Christian faiths, and you can see the line. It's a ragged end, by the way, because the British Social Attitude Service stopped reporting some of them because the numbers were getting too small. But the obvious line that's going up is the Muslim line. If you ask people how many people, what proportion of the country do they think is Muslim, people have a completely, on average, wrong perception of this. They think it's much, much higher than it is. It's actually, as you can see here, it's about 5 or 6% currently. And of course, as we know, enormous complexity and variety in terms of the British Muslim population. Ethnically, probably one of the most diverse Muslim populations in the world. Now, the question is, what's going to happen in the future? Well, this is a bit of a difficult picture if you're the Archbishop of Canterbury. The 75 people over 75, a third of people identify as Anglicans. But for people who are under 25, it's 1% of the population. 1%. Which is, severely problematic. So it means that Anglican line is likely to keep going down. It's not going to go down to zero, of course, but it's going to keep going down. So if you extrapolate, because we've got the demographic data on this, you can extrapolate without just getting out of a room and drawing a straight line. You can actually look at, well, how many people are there in different age groups. And if you do that, if you take a year like 2040, I've done a calculation on that. Just under 60% of the population are likely to say no, so be non-religious by then. So it's about 6% more than there are now. About 30% are likely to be Christians. Anglicans are likely to be, 5, 7, some percent, roughly the same as the Catholics. And about 15% are likely to be from non-Christian religions. And within that 15%, about 10%, maybe just a little bit less, are likely to be Muslims. So by 2040, it's very likely, any prediction is going to be wrong. So, it's just a question of how wrong, but it's likely that orders of magnitude, there are going to be more Muslims than either Catholics or Anglicans in the UK. Now, so this is a really big change, isn't it? And there's going to be a lot of these, a significant majority of people who are no faith at all. There's some other changes going on as well. British Christianity is changing. There's a gentleman called Bishop Mike Royal, who's an evangelical African bishop. He's now the General Secretary of Churches Together in England. And according to him, on an average Sunday in London, 60% of the churchgoers are Black. And, they're the backbone, Black people, British people, are the backbone of urban Anglican congregations in big centres. And the fastest growing denomination in the country, remember that purple line going up, is called the Redeemed Christian Church of God, which has got 700 to 800 churches and is basically Nigerian-based church. So as that Anglican line goes down, I think the other Christian line will level off. It looks like it will, but you can see what's happening there. It means the centre of gravity of the Anglican community is shifting out of the UK towards Africa, if you look at the numbers, which is a very interesting challenge, rather similar to the one the Catholic Church had a few years ago. Now, we're talking about ethnicity. There's a big ethnic divide here as well. And I think this is something which I'll come back to at the end. It's something we've got to be very careful about. 95% of the people who are non-religious are white origin. They would answer in the question to the survey. Doesn't mean there aren't any non-white people. There's, you know, sort of 5% is more than there are Hindus and Sikhs put together in the country are non-white, non-religious. And I know, you know, I have friends who are in black, associated of black humanists, and there are black ex-Muslims and so on. But if you look at the totality, the great majority of the non-religious are white. But 40% of white origin Brits have a religion, but 80% of non-white origin British people have a faith. So you can see there's becoming an ethnic divide emerging between, you know, the white non-religious and the non-white religious. Is, you know, that's just a trend. It's not the case at the moment because there's still lots of white people who are religious, but you can see that is the direction. And that's going to keep going because the bit that's shrinking, the Church of England, is the white bit. Most people from ethnic minorities who are religious are from, you know, are non-white background. So that's an issue. There's, if you like, the data. There's the data. I can share all these things. The other thing that's changing in this is religiosity. Very hard thing to measure. The way the British Social Attitude Survey does it is to say, is to ask people, you know, would you describe yourself as religious? That's their question. They ask people, and then they say, people say, well, I'm extremely or very religious, or I'm somewhat religious or neutral, or any other way. Now, what you can see here is a similar picture. If you look at the left-hand side, it's the Church of England. So the brown is the extremely or very religious, dark brown, somewhat religious, slightly lighter brown. And you can see that the Church of England numbers are much lower in both of those than anybody else, any of these other groups. They're big groups, so there's always exceptions, but in these big groupings, they're much lower. So again, the bit that's shrinking is the bit with lower religiosity. So as it shrinks, the average religiosity of the people who still identify as religious is going to go up. At the same time, if you look at the right-hand side, which is the people who are non-religious, you can see that most of those people say they are extremely or very non-religious. And in fact, that number has gone up as well. That's been the trend. So there's a polarization going on here. So if you look at some prognosis of this, you can see that there's going to be this growing non-religious majority, half with a broadly humanist worldview, mainly white, and mainly people who say they're very or extremely non-religious. There's going to be a diverse religious minority, more diverse than, you know, we've seen before. Mostly are going to be Christians still, mostly non-Anglican Christians. Muslims are going to be bigger than Anglicans, or Catholics, I expect, but maybe wrong. And increasingly, there's going to be people from ethnic minorities for whom their faith is important. They're going to have higher religiosity than the average is now. And there's diversity everywhere. Every group, however you slice this, you'll find diversity. People not conforming to what they theoretically ought to be thinking. It's really, really complex. Now, this is completely different landscape to the one that applied when dialogue was first seriously talked about. There was a thing which I think Soraya referred to last week, Parliament of World Religions, first met 1893 in Chicago. Completely different situation. There was another one called the Religions of Empire Conference. Wonderful title, Religions of Empire Conference. Don't get many of those these days. And that was in 1924, and it spawned the World Congress of Faiths, which still exists. It's a different world, and it's a different world even to when the Interfaith Network for the UK was started by the UK government in 1987. Now, as far as I know, no society has ever had to cope with this sort of complexity before. We're in a completely unique situation. Okay. And there's a lot of potential for misunderstandings, incomprehension, us and them thinking, segregation, potential hostility. There's a lot of risk. So to me, the need for dialogue is pretty big, and they're going to get bigger. But failing to include half the population in the dialogue is nuts. If you don't include the non-religious, you're missing half the issue. So that's the case to me for including the non-religious. Okay, so finally, I'd just like to talk about some of these challenges. This one, how can I talk, listen calmly to people who are actively campaigning against things I think are important? Now, that's actually quite a significant thing. And it particularly is significant when people, when I might say, well, why aren't we talking to humanists? And then I say, because you're campaigning against all the things we want. And despite the fact there's lots of agreement between humanists and most religious people on a lot of things, including like the importance of good quality education about religion and worldviews, or human rights, freedom of religion or belief. These are things that everybody agrees. But it's true that the history of humanism has often been the causes for which it's campaigned have been opposed by religious power. LGBT rights, female rights, abolition of blasphemy laws, those sorts of things. Okay? And it's still true now that issues like faith schools, particularly in my case, I think faith-based selection at state schools we campaign for, we don't like bishops in the House of Lords, or we want to campaign for assisted dying. So these are things a lot of religious groups oppose. But I think the thing is that in this country, we seem to have an environment where you can still have dialogue despite that disagreement. And I think that's a tribute to where we are. But it is also a tribute to the fact that a lot of work has been done in the past, and the government encourages dialogue. It's a lot more challenging. If you talk to a humanist in a South American country and say, well, why aren't you having dialogue with the local Catholic Church? They look at you as though you're a bit nuts, because these are the people that, there's much more antagonism, not everybody, but generally antagonism between the two sides, particularly on issues like abortion and gay rights. And Islamic countries, of course, that can be even more severe. Lots of countries have laws against blasphemy. There are 6 countries in which, in theory, you can be executed for blasphemy. And in Saudi Arabia, they introduced a law in 2014, and it says anyone who calls for atheist thought in any form or calls into question the fundamentals of the Islamic religion on which this country is based is classified as a terrorist. So if I said what I said to you 10 minutes ago, I could be, and said that in Saudi Arabia, I could be arrested and put in prison. So, and right now there's the president of the Humanist Association in Nigeria was sentenced to 24 years in prison because he said some things that people didn't agree with about Islam. So, this is an issue. It's an issue, and it made me think really that there are some prerequisites for dialogue to flourish. And you would have had the same position in previous, where you had a powerful Christian church which was clamping down on anybody, any dissenters and any heretics would have applied exactly the same. There are 3 things that seem to be prerequisites, which is to a large degree freedom of religion and belief and freedom of expression. So that's one. Limited institutional religious power. So you don't have an overweening church or religious institution which can impose itself on other people. We obviously have got religious power, but it's not overweening in that sense. And the final thing is a culture in which respect and tolerance are are seen as virtues. And I think in this country we're fortunate enough we hit on all three of those, even though we're not strictly speaking secular, but starting not fully. So that's one. I can't respect beliefs I think are even wrong or even malign. That's another objection. Now I think I put this one up because I think it's worth just looking at this word respect. The word respect comes up a lot when you're talking about dialogue. It's used a lot when you talk. If you go into a school now, you see the word, school values, respect is always there. That's the number one. There's research showing it's the number one values in schools. But I think this statement is actually, it's problematic because it's looking at the wrong object of respect. I don't expect somebody who is deeply religious, for whom their faith is a hugely important part of their life, and their belief in God is a hugely important part of their life, genuinely to respect the view of somebody like me who thinks that their God doesn't exist. That would be utterly unreasonable. So, that's fine. They can't respect me, and I can't respect their beliefs either in that strict sense. But what you can do is respect a decent person because they're a fellow human being and is a decent human being. You can respect that person. And you can also respect the importance of that person, of their religion or belief or beliefs. Those are two aspects of respect that apply. But I think it's useful just to unpack the respect thing. It's about people to me, not about beliefs. And of course, it's muddy because we have shared cultural heritage. Humanists refer to Adam and Eve and the Good Samaritan and stuff, of course, the same as everybody else does, without having any belief in the sort of unseen order that comes underneath it. One that's a bit more problematic and applies to everybody, I think, is the problem is that some people just aren't interested in that, don't care. And some people are positively opposed to it. I think the problem of indifference is quite a serious thing and very hard to overcome. For a lot of people, this whole area of religion or belief doesn't feature in their life at all. They don't even think about it. And for others, including some humanists, they think, yeah, this is a great idea, but do you want to spend an evening doing it? Not really. It's not something that comes up high enough against people's agenda. My dialogue, you must have found this, those practitioners, it's a minority sport. And we can do our best, and there's an idea, I'll come up in a minute, which might help a little bit. But that's just life. There's a lot of competing stuff. There's a bit further on this where you can go, where people are actually reluctant to engage. And it can be, very easy to be paranoid about this. You think, oh, it's because they're humanists, they don't like us, but maybe it's true of other people as well. I've noticed, for instance, that a couple of years ago, I'd made some efforts to try and have dialogue organised dialogue between the people who are Black humanists and members of Black evangelical churches in London. And people are friendly. Did it happen? No, it didn't. You send out, so what about finding a date for this thing? It sinks. Obviously, people aren't interested. Why? Don't know. Is it threatening? Is it because we're atheists and we're evil? I don't know. Same true with Muslim groups. As I mentioned before, we've done a lot with liberal Muslim groups and had some really good exchanges with them and made some very good contact. But when we try to approach the main Muslim umbrella group in the country and said, what about a dialogue? We just haven't had a positive response. And my personal experience, just from my local interfaith groups, I'm involved in a couple of local ones, is that local mosques have not been very interested in engaging. Very friendly when you meet people, but it's not something that's very important to them, which I think is a shame. Why? I don't know. Is it that atheism is an enemy? I don't think so, because I think, often the heads of this interfaith things are people from other faiths. I don't know. Obviously, for us, a sensitive issue when it comes to Islam is apostasy. we have a group under the umbrella of Humanist UK, which called Faith to Faithless, and what that was started by two young ex-Muslims, but it covers people from all sorts of what they call high control religions. People who've had a problem when they decided they want to change their religion belief, usually to leave it, but that's caused some problems with their family or their community and so on. It applies, it applies not to all ex-Muslims, of course not, but it applies to some ex-Muslims, but it applies in spades to people who are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance. That's a really, really big thing. And, it's a terrible thing. You're ostracized by your own family, and that's, the people you love the most. So that's a really big thing. So this group provides networking support for those sorts of people. And final thing I want to mention, because it leads into a sort of final point, which is this one. You only get to talk to the liberals. Okay. What about all of the others? Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with this. Okay? If you can only talk to the liberals, it's still a good thing to do, because you still have interesting conversations. You're still bolstering the position of liberals within your own community, and they're talking to other people in their own communities as well. But there was I think actually, interestingly, this was something quoted by Soraya last week. There's a American Ismaili writer called Ibu Patel, and he talked about a thing called the faith line. And he says the faith line was going to be characteristic of the 21st century. And on one side of the faith line, according to him, was people who he called religious totalitarians. And he characterized them as people who say there's only one interpretation of one religion is a legitimate way of being, believing, and belonging on earth. Everyone else needs to be cowed or converted or condemned or killed. So this is a very extreme position. On the other side is the religious pluralists who hold that people believing in different creeds and belonging to different communities need to learn to live together. Now, that's a very black and white thing. Reality is much more nuanced, of course, than that. But it does highlight the fact that the underlying premise of dialogue is a belief in pluralism. So if you don't believe in pluralism as a good thing, your whole attitude towards dialogue is going to be different. And that's a challenge. Having said that, if you talk to somebody who would be towards the totalitarian end, it doesn't mean it's useless talking to them. They may still say, well, I want a peaceful society. They may want a peaceful society based on the hegemony of their worldview. But and dialogue is okay. You get relationships, you learn about each other. But as a pluralist, you've got to be aware that the person you're talking to doesn't accept that it's a good thing that there is pluralism. And therefore you've got to be aware of that and be cautious about it. This touches on a wider issue, and the final thing I want to mention, which is about values. There was a lecture series done about a year ago by Linda Woodhead, Professor Linda Woodhead, which I guess a lot of people here would know. And it was called Values Are the New Religion. She's a professor of sociology at Langston University. And her thesis is what it says, but her thesis is basically that there was in this country a broad sort of ethic, which she characterizes as a Christian ethic, which she characterizes as give your life. It was a self-sacrificing ethic. The right thing to do is sacrifice yourself to others. And it was a Christian ethic, but it's been replaced, in her view, by a different ethic, a liberal ethic, which she characterizes as live your life. And the live your life ethic doesn't mean that you're ditching responsibility for other people. You do care about other people, but it's also balanced by saying, well, I've got to look after my personal well-being at the same time. And so it's a more balanced thing. Now she associates that change with what she calls the moral institutional Christianity, and she talks about child abuse and all of the other things that scandals. She's big on, she's a feminist and how the church hasn't adopted that, and LGBT rights and so on. But the point that she's making is that there's a big chunk of people, the majority of people in the country, ragged at the edges, but have this broadly liberal worldview. And then there's minorities who hold other worldviews, and you get friction between the two of them, between the non-liberal worldviews and the other worldviews. But it's about values. So if that's correct, and I think that she's a very bright person, and I have a lot of time for this idea. If you then turn that lens on dialogue, you say, well, humanism is an inherently liberal worldview. Okay, so it's very easy, therefore, for a humanist to have a good dialogue, find loads of agreement with a liberal member of a faith group. Very easy. And because you're sharing the same liberal values. The liberal religious person, though, may have a religious identity which they share with a more fundamentalist person. They may have the same practices, they may have the same beliefs, and have the same sense of community, but they don't share the same values, same liberal values. And that's why a lot of people say intra-religious discussions can be a lot more challenging than what inter-religious ones, for that reason, because one side can be saying that you're not true to the faith or whatever it is. So it does raise the question in my mind, would it be better if we sort of reframe dialogue a little bit to put a greater emphasis on values and maybe dial down a little bit about beliefs? Because maybe they're not that important, really. To me, it doesn't matter that much what's going on inside somebody's head, but how they behave is more important. So would that be better in finding common ground? And would it help to draw the people who have a more fundamental view of this into the discussion, because you're talking about values? So we haven't got, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it. So draw final conclusions. Where are we? Well, there's an unprecedented, diverse religion and belief landscape where nobody's been in this situation before. Dialogue is not perfect. It's got some constraints. I've just talked about 4 of them. There's a whole lot more of them. They are limited, to what you can do with dialogue. But it's a good thing to do. It can certainly help. And so, and its need is growing. But you've got to include people who are not religious in it. Otherwise, half the population is excluded. And it's going to be more, approaching 60% in my forecast. But Linda Woodhead's idea may be helpful in this. It may provide a useful perspective in thinking about this. And one thing we've got to guard against, or just having in the back of our minds, is not falling into having a religious versus non-religious divide, which becomes a fault line in a society which has an ethnic dimension to it. Societies under tension, these things can become important, and we should try and, I think we should do our best to avoid that from happening. That's all I need to say.